Hi folks, Mr. Long here. Going to do a quick screencast on how to isolate variables in formulas using BEDMAS and inverse operations. So the first thing I want you to note here is, so what we're going to do here is we're going to isolate for x and y equals mx plus b. What I'm doing is I'm picking fairly familiar formulas in two of the three cases at least, so that you know how to do this. So if we want to get x isolated or get x by itself, so what we need to do is we need to look at what are the BEDMAS operations that are applied to x and then undo those. Okay, and then undo those. So here we go. So if I'm to look at that, I notice that the first thing that happens to x, so if I go over to here and I write down BEDMAS and inverse, the very first thing that happens to x is there's multiplication by m. Okay, once multiplication by m is done, in this case, I read to the right, and I see a plus sign, plus b. Okay, so now I need to do, and that's it. Those are the only operations. Multiply by m, and then you would get that answer, right? So if you had a number for x, that's the way to imagine this. If I had a number for x, how would I calculate everything on the right side there? So I would multiply by m, I would get that answer, and then I would add on b. So what's the inverse of that? Inverse means two things. It means opposite order, but also opposite operation or process. So instead of multiply by m, add b, I'm then going to minus b and divide by m. Okay, so I'm isolating for x. So what I do is I start with x equals now. And I have to look at what am I starting with on the other side? Well, it's y. What's the first thing that gets done? Is we subtract b. Okay, so that's done. The next thing I do is to divide by m, and remember that every inverse operations applies to everything else that comes before. So that means I divide everything by m. Now, another way to write that is I could go x equals y over m minus b over m. Okay, those are equivalent. Just like 10 minus 4 divided by 2 is 10 divided by 2 minus 4 divided by 2. It's the same thing. Okay, let's move on to the next example. And again, at any time in this, pause, rewind, go over things. So we go to our second example. And this is the ax plus by plus c equals 0, and we isolate for y. We have to do this a fair bit, right? So I want to isolate for y. So again, BEDMAS and inverse. And I'm isolating for y. And again, I can read left to right, right to left. It doesn't matter. If I look at this, one of the things I might actually want to do is write the term here first. So I could put by plus ax plus c equals 0. Now, do I have to do that? Absolutely not. But it might be helpful to do that. I think you'll see why. So, if I had a number for y, what's the first thing it would multiply by? It would multiply by b. By the way, this b means BEDMAS, not the b in the formula. So I'd multiply by b. Once I get that done, I would add ax. And a lot of people struggle with that too. They think it's multiplication because it's a times x. But we have to remember it's the operations that apply to y. Y is only multiplied by b. That's the only time it's multiplied. After that, it's b times y, and then we add ax and we add c. So what's the inverse of that? Minus c minus ax and divide by b. Okay? If I notice, that all applies to 0. So what does y equal? Well, y equals 0 minus c minus ax, that gives those first two, and then divides by b. In this case, I'm going to do both of those. Now, if you notice, I probably want to write this as mx plus b form, which means that needs to go first, right? Because that's the slope, negative a over b. So I would rewrite this as y equals negative a over b times by x minus c over b. Okay, and that would be into y equals mx plus b form. Okay, so again, pause, rewind, go over this. But again, the focus is on bedmass and inverse operations. Okay, we're going to do this one. Now there's a little subtle trick to this one. So we're going to, in this one, we want to isolate for c in this equation. A equals, in brackets, b minus c all over d. So something I'm going to do here is I'm going to rewrite this. So if I'm isolating for something, I'm isolating for this c. One of the things I want to think of is I want to think of subtraction in this case as b plus negative c. Right? Because otherwise I'm going to get confused as I work through this and wonder if it's, take away c, if it's the difference between b and c. But in terms of the algebra processes, I've got to read away from that c. So I'm going to start by reading away from c. So the first thing I notice here is it's minus c, or b plus negative c. So that's actually multiplication by negative 1. Only then do I add b. Okay, so anyway, let's start at this. So the first thing that happens to c when I see this is it gets multiplied by negative 1. Then the next thing I see is there's a plus sign for plus b. Once I have that done, I divide by d. Okay, so I have to do my brackets first, and then within the brackets, I follow order of operations. So again, the trick there is to see b minus c as b plus negative c. And the negative of c means you're multiplying by negative 1. Now, what's the inverse, by the way, of multiplying by negative 1? Well, multiplying by negative 1, the inverse of that is, multiplying by negative 1, the inverse of that is to divide by negative 1. But you know what? Think about that for a second. What's 5 times negative 1? What's 5 divided by negative 1? It's the same result. So multiplying and dividing by 1 or negative 1, the inverse operation doesn't change. So the inverse of multiplying by negative 1 is dividing by negative 1, but it's also just multiplying by negative 1 again. Because when you're working with ones, it doesn't change anything. Okay, so let's do this. So this one, the inverse is multiply by d, subtract b, and then you're not going to like this, but it's multiply by negative 1. Right? The inverse of multiplying by negative 1 is multiplying by negative 1. That's because dividing by negative 1 and multiplying by negative 1 are the same thing. And it's a lot easier to multiply. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to start, I start with a on the other side. So we're going to write this as c equals, and the first inverse operation, this is all applied to a, by the way. So I'm going to multiply by d, check. I subtract b, check. And now I have to multiply by negative 1 or divide by negative 1, whatever is easier. So I can, you know what, it might actually, in this case, I can multiply or divide by negative 1. I get the same result. What I might want to do is divide by negative 1 there, divide by negative 1 there. It might be easier in this case, so I probably should have thought through that a little more. Okay, so how do I rewrite that now, though? So I rewrite that as a times d divided by negative 1 is just negative a times d, and a negative divided by a negative is a positive, so it's going to be plus b. Okay, and that is your final answer. That's a pretty tough one. Okay, that's a pretty tough one. Okay, so again, rewind, go through this again if you need to. Have yourself a good day.